Sacred Heart is proud to sponsor Pensacola Histories in recognition of the Daughters of Charity who brought their mission of care to Pensacola over 90 years ago.
Hello and welcome to our continuing series of stories on Pensacola, Florida, the first place city in North America. Today we're continuing with one of the biographical sketches, the men who I consider made a tremendous difference in the evolution of our story, commercially and otherwise. And our subject for today is Henry Baars. Baars was a very unique story because it began not in the United States, but in faraway Oldenburg, Germany, where young Baars was born in 1844. His father was a successful landowner in that area, and the young Baars was set to be the heir to the estate, if you will. But then along came the changes that were coming along in Germany. This was with the first Kaiser and with the beginning of the first great premier, and as a result of this, the German army was being built very rapidly, and the Baars family feared that their young son, Henry, might be drafted and conscripted and brought into that army. And so they quickly arranged for him to leave. They arranged for a substitute for him in the army, and then they bought him a small partnership in a British firm that was doing export business in pine, southern yellow pine, out of the city of Savannah, Georgia. And Henry Baars left his family then in the early part of 1860, and you can kind of imagine what things were like. The Baars family realized that they would probably never see their son again, but they were sending him off to what they felt was safe. Well, Henry Baars joined the British firm there and began his work, and within a matter of months, the South began its operations. The Confederate States of America was formed, and war began, and wouldn't you know it, Henry Baars rushed forward and volunteered for the army. One can almost imagine what the parents back in Germany thought, but nonetheless, there he was. And through the next 4 years, Henry Baars was a part of the army. He was wounded twice, finally captured, and when the war ended, he came back, of course, basically a shadow of his former self. But as this happened, the people of Savannah decided to do something nice for the returning servicemen. They had what we would call a big party, which included a parade, and the returning servicemen were to march down the street. And the citizens there made it a point that every family was going to try to put together some kind of present that they could give to some returning servicemen. And one of the families that did this was named Dunwoody. Now, the Dunwoodies had been very wealthy. They had been very successful in land operations, but like many others in the wartime, they had lost much of their wealth. But there they were along the street waiting for the servicemen to pass by. And one of the young ladies, just a young child, she was only 12 or 13 years old, was young Mary Ellison. Well, Mary Ellison saw this bedraggled young man coming down the street, and she tugged at her father's sleeve and said, "May we give our present to him?" And so the father said, "Fine, bring him over." They gave Henry Baars the little gift, and they took him home to have lunch with them. And as they did so, the family of Henry became friends. Well, years passed. For the next 4 years, Henry went back to his partnership in the British firm, and things were going well for him. But by 1870, it was obvious that the pine export business for the future was not going to be out of Savannah, but rather out of Pensacola, because by now the great lumbering era had begun here. And so Henry Baars became a bridegroom. He and young 17-year-old Mary Ellison Dunwoody became man and wife, and they made their move to Pensacola where he began an export pine business. Now, Henry Baars was very wise. He knew his trade very well. He opened an office down on South Palafox Street, and it's a building that still stands there. It's the closest office building on the east side of Palafox Street as one goes down to the wharf. And Henry set up shop, and he was extremely successful. Now, an export agent was a sort of a go-between, if you will, between someone in Europe who wanted to buy and needed finished pine lumber, and of course Henry would deal with the lumber mills in this area, making arrangements for transfer of the materials that had been cut and manufactured here aboard ship, and then on their way to the market in either Britain, France, Germany, or someplace like that. And Baars was extremely successful. He built his business very carefully, and by the time we reached reached the year 1875, he was servicing not one or two, but over 60 mills, which operated in Northwest Florida and South Alabama. They were being extremely successful. Well, as all this developed, Henry Baars made arrangements to bring Mary Ellison's brother, Brian Dunwoody, to Pensacola to go into business with him. And of course, as Brian Dunwoody came here, he was also very bright and very energetic, and he saw another need, an opportunity in the tugboat business, because tugboats were needed almost everywhere in the shipping process here. And so young Brian became part of a tugboat company, as well as assisting Henry Baars, and things went along extremely successful for them. Well, in time, the Baars had children, and through the next 20 years, things went along very beautifully. Now, we must tell you, as part of the story, we must tell you about one of the customs that evolved between Henry Baars and Mary Ellison. I don't know how this came about, but the family tells it as being true. And as it turned out, when we get into the late 1870s, Henry Baars would always come to his wife as a gift-giving occasion came along, and he would say to her, kind of with a grin, "What would you like this time for your birthday, for our anniversary, for Christmas," whatever the occasion might be? And her answer was always the same: "Buy me a piece of land." Well, of course, by now, much land, particularly close to the city of Pensacola, had been cut over. It was available, standing idle, and it was cheap. So Henry Baars would go out there, and so for her birthday, Mary Ellison Baars would get 100 acres or 200 acres or 300, and on and on and on this accumulation developed. Now, leaping ahead just a little bit in the story, we take us all the way to the time that Henry Baars finally passed on. That was all the way into the year 1909. And by then, those little gifts that had come several times a year had accumulated, and Mary Ellison Baars had about 6,500 acres of property. Tremendous area, and that, of course, covered an area well to the north and east of the city. Well, business went along well, and this property was accumulated. The agency was doing well, and of course, by now, Baars' sons were with him. And one day in late 1898, the sons and the father were sitting together having coffee. Excuse me for my throat, I'll take a little sip here. And that morning they were reading the paper, and there was a story which young Theo Baars caught. And he said, listen to this. Listen to what the government has done now. The Spanish War is over, and they've decided they want to do something nice for all those who served, and they're going to give them warrants which they can exchange for land on Perdido Key, Florida. Well, his brother looked at him, and his father too, and he said, "Why in the world would they do that? Why would someone in Wisconsin or Maine or Indiana want property on Perdido Key? Well, there isn't a tree, there isn't a road, there isn't a dock, there's nothing there." And young Theo said, "That's right. Let's take a look at this and see if this might be an opportunity." And it was. So very quickly, they obtained a roster of all the men who had served in the Spanish War. They opened 3 checking accounts, if you will, and hired 3 young men and sent them out to make contacts with the servicemen who were receiving these warrants. And they literally, if we talked in today's parlance, we would say that they bought the property on the balance of a few pennies on the dollar. And when the Baars family was finished, they owned 13,500 acres of all of the eastern end of Perdido Key. A tremendous buy. Now, of course, they had to sit on that and pay taxes and gain no profit from it for many years. But when the time came, oh my, beginning in the 1970s, those who live in this area will recognize Perdido Key suddenly exploded as a vacation spa and also as a residential area. And of course, those who owned the land, of course, were the ones who profited. Well, now, taking the story forward a little bit, but you get into the early part of the 1900s, and Mary Ellison Baars had a dream. She, of course, had acquired a great deal of property, much of which was around Bayou Tahar, particularly on the east side. And Mary Ellison had made a lot of friends up in the Detroit area, and she had a dream. She said, "Wouldn't it be nice if we shared this wonderful area that we have down in there for winter living and develop what we would today in the 21st century would call a condominium complex?" And she said, wouldn't it be nice if we built some very beautiful houses here, right near the bayou, have a wonderful gated entrance with trees parading the people in, and it make this a wonderful vacation home. And so they began to plan for it. Now, the Baars had vacationed abroad a number of times by now, and one of the places that they had enjoyed the most was Cordoba in Spain. So they decided they were going to name this new area Cordova Park. And they made all the plans. They had the beautiful drawings made. They had the literature printed, ready for the development of this Cordova Park area. These houses, by the way, were about 4,000 square feet, and along with them was going to be a clubhouse and a boathouse, all the nice things that would go with it. And the plan went forward, and then, of course, along came the panic of 1907, and the idea just absolutely folded, and nothing remained of the idea, except in the course of getting ready, Mr. Henry Baars had planted a double row of trees along what is now 12th Avenue. So when one drives out to the north and drives toward the airport, drives along just before we come to the Cordova, or to the Bayou Tahar Bridge, there indeed are the trees that were planted for what would have been this wonderful winter estate. Well, as all of this continued, of course, Henry Baars remains successful, and by the time he died in 1909, the family had accumulated all this property. And one of the first things, of course, that his mother and his two sons decided to do was to begin to develop the area that we now call East Hill. Now, to do that, of course, was difficult. They had all this property. It had been pretty well cut over. They could clean it up. But getting people out there to see it made it difficult, because there were basically very few passable streets, and we were just then getting into the automobile era. So they had a dream, and they carried it out. By then, of course, our Pensacola streetcar system up and down Palafox and the adjacent streets was a primary mode of transport. So, what the Baars did was to work with the transit company to arrange for the building of another streetcar segment, which went right out into the area of East Hill. And using that method, of course, people could come and see the properties, and they did. And basically, people began to buy and to build homes. One thing we want to remember on that as well, as they did this, as they were putting all of this together, they were concentrating a good bit on Bayou Tahar, which back in those days, by the way, was called Lake Tahar. And they wanted to have people have access to it, because it's such a beautiful place to live. And one of the streets that was put through first was right up to basically to the bayou. And Henry, I can just visualize John and Theo Baars standing there looking at this and say, what do we name this street? Well, they looked out and said, well, we can look right out on the lake. Why don't we call this Lakeview? And as a consequence, they named that east-west street Lakeview Avenue, and it is still Lakeview. And people still wonder, where was the lake? Well, basically, it was because they called the bayou back then, they called it a lake rather than a bayou. Well, we come into the period of the late period of the years right after World War II, and of course now with the expansion of population, people were beginning to move into the areas which the Baars family had, and they began to sell off the property which Mary Ellison Baars had collected. And if you look at that today, well, you can get an idea of how successful all of this was, because on that property we have East Pensacola Heights, the Pensacola Municipal Airport, we have the Pensacola Junior College, and many of the first-class subdivisions, including the Cordova Park area itself, all came from that land which was accumulated by the Baars family as gifts to Mrs. Baars for the various celebrations each year. Well, Henry Baars and the family that followed, of course, have been very generous with their property. They've made gifts to all kinds of organizations that have needed it to put together things like junior achievement and baseball fields, and of course the major malls, two major malls are on that property too, and the negotiation between the family and the mall owners, the Simon brothers, have made it possible for Pensacola to have first-class facilities there. So we look back on Henry Baars, a man who was born in Germany, fled to this country as the German army was organizing itself in 1860, became an agent in Savannah, then he moved to Pensacola with his bride in 1870, and from that point on, I guess we can say, well, the rest is history. He was a very successful man, a very generous man, and I think we could also say that he taught some lessons to his family members to do good things for the community and also to do good things for the family. And so that is the story of Henry Baars, one of our true founding people of the late 19th and early 20th century who really made a difference in Pensacola.